Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this Red Gaming to the Con video, we're going to be talking about consoles. That's right, we're going to take a break from the PC hardware and focus on console hardware. Specifically, the release of the PlayStation 5. As you might be aware, the PS4 Pro is here, and it won't be long until the Scorpio arrives on store shelves, most likely around November time. But despite the fact that the Scorpio has about 6 TFLOPS of performance, there is an analyst by the name of Damian Thong, and he believes that we're going to see 10 TFLOPS from the PlayStation 5, even though it won't arrive until about the latter half of 2018. Now, I know what you're going to say, well, he's an analyst. Does it really mean that much? I mean, you know, he could predict anything. Well, this is true, and normally I do take the analyst's predictions with somewhat of a pinch of salt. However, he had previously predicted two things correctly. One is the arrival of the PS4 Pro, and the second of which is the PS4 Slim. So his predictions when it comes to the PlayStation side of things is actually fairly decent. He's provided a quote, which is, the following. We see a sustained profit growth in game and network services. We forecast OP growth from 140 billion yen in the third quarter of 2017 to 180 billion in the third quarter of 2018. That's financial year, just to clarify. Driven by expanding software sales and profits, a rising digital ratio and higher mix of first-party titles will help margins. Horizon Zero Dawn, which launched on the 28th of February, looks to have a good start with a Metacritic of 88%. While we have tempered expectations to account for rivalry with the Microsoft/Xbox and PC gaming, we note the success of PlayStation VR, which has reached 915,000 units sold, highlights the health of the ecosystem. We expect Sony to launch a 10 teraflop plus PlayStation 5 in the second half of 2018 to secure the installed base. End quote. On top of that, it's worth noting the release window is slightly at odds of the other well-known analyst, Michael Pachter, who believes we're not going to see the system until 2020, which is a couple of years later, obviously. Now, there is one reason I believe the PlayStation 5 will hit in 2018, and that is it's not as hard to design an x86 system as a custom chip from the ground up. Now, I know I'm going to get people jumping on the comments and say the PlayStation 4 or the Xbox had custom chips, you know, the Xbox had ESRAM, and I 100% agree, this is true, but still, it's not as difficult to have an iterative process because essentially they can just take components, for example, the Vega architecture, which is, you know, going to be out this year, or they can take, you know, a Ryzen CPU, basically shrink it, customize it, whatever they need to do, and Bob's your uncle, Fanny's your aunt. And then all they essentially need to do is just hit certain power requirements, certain pricing requirements, and certain performance requirements. Power, just to clarify, means, you know, heat, that type of stuff, an actual energy draw from the wall. Obviously, you can't have, you know, water cooling and a case that's the size of, you know, a small dog. It has to be pretty compact and sleek and elegant just to look good and to fit into a nice, you know, container. And also, it needs to, of course, be able to withstand fairly decent range of operating temperatures. But the other benefit of x86 is that essentially you've got pretty damn great backwards compatibility. One of the problems with the PlayStation 1 to the PlayStation 2 is, despite the fact that you had essentially the same chip, one of the same chips in the PlayStation 2 to maintain backwards compatibility, when you went to the PS3, that wasn't there, and, you know, technically you could do backwards compatibility, but that was released with some, with some PS3 models. Then PS4 came out, and backwards compatibility was all over the place. You know, you had to do it online with certain games and streaming. Microsoft managed it, of course, with the Xbox One, over the Xbox 360, which was phenomenal, but it was quite the feat of engineering. In other words, it's just a pain in the buttocks. Whereas on the other hand, if you've got an x86 architecture, it doesn't matter too much. You can basically, I wouldn't say just write an emulator or just write a few lines of code, but it is considerably easier. And this, from what we gather, because obviously details of the Scorpio are not exactly forthcoming from Microsoft, they are just simply saying it's going to offer about 6 TFLOPS of computing performance, about 8 processor cores, but what type of cores they are, about 320 gigabytes per second. And I say about because, it might be slightly more, slightly less in terms of GFLOP performance. It could be like 6.1 or 6.2. I'm going to assume that's going to depend on yields and what they can get out of the GPU clocks and all this stuff. But we know that it's going to be quite a beast. And from what analysts have said and what some games developers have whispered, it's not really an Xbox One upgrade. It's almost like saying it's an Xbox 2, and I don't really like that term, but what else can you call it? It's essentially an updated Xbox, but it's almost a sequel. So it is completely backwards compatible. This is true, but it's also going to be a lot more powerful than the previous unit. It's going to be about 4 or 5 times more powerful, maybe slightly more, depending on optimizations of what Microsoft really managed to put in the system. In other words, it's going to be quite the beast. And one of the benefits of the Scorpio, of course, is you don't have the tying of performance to the ESRAM. Yes, ESRAM has improved, but it's still a pain in the ass. Whereas now, you've just got a unified amount of RAM, which is 320 gigabytes per second. So even if you start taking into account overheads and OS reserves for the bandwidth, you've still got ample amounts to be able to handle the rendering of the GPU, and you don't need to worry about so much about rendering from ESRAM and DDR3. It's just a lot simpler. As for the PlayStation 5, it's obvious they are going to be targeting 4K displays, which should become more abundant by the time the system actually goes on store shelves. As you probably are aware, prices for 4K screens are starting to go down. They're not quite at the point where everyone and their mother has one, but they are getting to the point where a good 4K display, which, isn't the best, but it's certainly decent enough where most people can afford it, isn't that much more expensive in terms of like 4 or 5 times the price of a decent 1080p display of the same size. And obviously this is going to become cheaper and cheaper as panel technology becomes better and more refined and just cheaper to produce. Sony are also quite keen to capitalize on virtual reality. Now, I'll be honest, I've got mixed feelings about VR. I think in some ways it's really good. In other ways, it hasn't really quite tied in yet. I think it's definitely going to be a future for certain games, but I think we're still very early in the technology's adoption. But the PS4 VR is obviously a really good introduction to that. But the console just does not have enough raw performance to really be able to run the system at the resolution or the frame rates that we would really like. So in that case, the PS5 could be quite nice. As for the performance, well, and the hardware inside the machine, your guess is as good as mine. I'm going to make the assumption, and obviously I don't know for certain, that Sony are going to stick to AMD because it would make a lot of sense in terms of iterative hardware upgrades. And presumably, we could see a variant of Ryzen, probably for a low-power device, and possibly a variant of either Vega or possibly Navi. I'm going to assume it's going to be a custom version of Vega, because that would make a lot of sense for the time schedule. And we'll probably see, of course, a couple of customizations that Sony are doing internally. Like we know they added volatile bit, they increased the amount of compute queues for the PS4. So what they're going to do for the PS5, we can only wait and see. I would hopefully like to see Sony really embrace the PS5 as a really powerful machine, but it also means that Microsoft are going to be in a weird position, because if they release the 6 TFLOPS of performance this year, it's going to basically be outshone by a system that's almost twice as powerful just a year later, which is pretty much the same situation that they've put Sony in, which is kind of weird. Anyway, it is just an analyst's prediction, but he does have a pretty good track record. What are your thoughts on this? Let me know. I'll see you soon. Bye for now.